Alright, so I've been getting a lot of questions on how chefs make steaks taste so good. It's really not that hard. A few simple techniques, maybe a couple trade secrets. We're going to have an amazing bone-in tomahawk ribeye. But we're not just going to make a steak. We're going to make an entire steakhouse dinner at home for much cheaper. Let's get going. Alright, so the day before you want to make your steakhouse dinner, we're going to start the dessert. When I think of a steakhouse dessert, I think of classics like bread pudding. This bread pudding is incredible and it's pretty simple to make. Start with 4 cups of heavy cream, add a cup of sugar, about 2 tablespoons of cinnamon, and then the seeds from 1 vanilla pod. Alright, put your cream mixture on a medium heat and we're going to whisk in all the ingredients. We need the cream to reach at least 170 degrees, but we want to try to keep it below 190. Once you get it above 190, you have to worry about it boiling over. Once our cream mixture is to the desired temperature, we're going to whisk it into a bowl with 4 eggs, but we've got to do this very slowly. If we just pour this hot cream into these eggs, they're going to scramble. We want to avoid that, so we're going to do what's called tempering. Adding a very small amount of the hot cream mixture to the eggs while beating them to slowly bring their temperature up. Add the cream little by little, whisking the eggs constantly. And by the time you get about half of the cream mixture in there, the eggs should be tempered, and then you can dump the rest of the cream in there all at once. Now pour the hot custard over your bread, and we're just going to let it soak overnight. Use a hard, crusty bread for this. I'm using leftover sourdough. We want some bread with texture that won't fall apart once we add our hot custard to it. I usually let it sit at a room temperature for about an hour before I put it in the refrigerator, just so I don't heat my refrigerator up too much. Alright, now for the real reason you're here, let's talk about steak. This is an almost 3-pound tomahawk ribeye. It's thicker than a Snicker. Actually, it's thicker than about 2 or 3 Snickers. And to ensure this steak holds its shape when it cooks, I'm going to truss the steak. You've probably heard of trussing a chicken, but here's how you truss a bone-in steak. Wrap some butcher's twine around the bone, then pull it around the perimeter of the steak. Check to make sure the string is kind of centered on the steak so it doesn't fall off while we're cooking, and then you can tie a knot and cut off the excess string. We want to let this steak sit at room temperature for about an hour before we cook it. Letting the internal temperature of the steak get as close to room temperature as possible is going to help it cook evenly. This is a very critical step that you do not want to skip. Now we've got to talk sides. Typically at a steakhouse you're going to get some sort of potato. My favorite potatoes at a steakhouse are scalloped potatoes. Start by chopping up some bacon. I'm using thick cut applewood smoked bacon, but you can use whatever you have. Then we're going to dice 1 onion, about 5 cremini mushrooms, and then we're going to slice some chives. Just get them all lined up evenly from the root end, hold them together, and slice them thinly. If you need to stop and readjust your hand, feel free. Burn off your bacon in a saute pan. Once it's done, drain off most of the fat. Then add your onions and mushrooms, season with salt, and cook until caramelized. While the bacon mixture is cooking, we can peel some Idaho or russet potatoes. Then we can slice them. I'm using a mandolin. If you don't have one, just use a knife. Put the sliced potatoes in a container of water. This will keep them from browning and take out some of the starchiness. Now we're going to make our custard for the scalloped potatoes. Start by whisking 2 eggs and then adding a quart of cream. This cream is cold. I don't know why I had it in a pan, but you can just pour it straight from the carton. Season with salt and pepper, and then we're going to grate some cheese into it. I'm using Parmigiano Reggiano, but any hard white cheese like Gruyere or even white cheddar will be great. Then we're going to add our bacon mixture and some of our chives. Whisk this all together and be sure to taste it, see if it needs more seasoning. Now we can add our drained potatoes and mix it all together. Spray a large baking dish with nonstick spray and add your potatoes. I had a little bit of potato left over, so I'm doing a small dish as well. I like to do it this way rather than just dumping it straight in there, so that way all the goodies that sank to the bottom end up on top. Bake the scalloped potatoes at 350 degrees for about an hour. You know they're done when the custard is set, it's golden brown on top, and when you insert a knife into the potato, you shouldn't get any resistance. If it still feels hard, then put it back in the oven. Alright, the next day, your bread pudding custard should look like this. Stir up the bread, make sure it's all thoroughly coated, and then divide it into whatever baking dishes you want to use. They can be individual dishes like this, or you can cook it in one big casserole dish, whatever you want. Spray whatever baking dish you're going to use with non-stick spray, then fill it about 3/4 full with the bread pudding. Bake it at 350 until it's golden brown and the custard is set. The time is going to depend on what baking dish you use. You know the bread pudding is done when it's golden brown, and when you shake it, it really shouldn't jiggle. The custard should be totally set. Now to top our bread pudding, we're going to make a banana brandy caramel. But we're not going to go through all the trouble of making caramel the traditional way. This sauce is super easy and it's amazing. Get a saute pan and melt a 1/4 cup of butter and add 2/3 cup of brown sugar. You just want to melt the sugar, you don't really need to cook it. Then we're going to add a teaspoon of vanilla extract, a teaspoon of ground cinnamon, and 3/4 cup of brandy. Don't be shy. Stir the sauce and be careful not to get it too close to the edge. It can catch on fire. If it does ignite, don't worry. Pull the pan off the heat and just let it burn out. It'll go out on its own. You don't need to extinguish it or cover it or anything like that. Pull it away from the flame and you'll be good. Now we want to let the sauce simmer until it thickens a little bit. You can tell it's the right consistency when the bubbles start to grow on each other. It doesn't take very long. At that point, we can add a 1/2 cup of chopped pecans and a sliced up banana. Get this all mixed together and then turn the heat off. You don't really want to cook the bananas because they'll fall apart. Spoon the sauce over the bread pudding and then top with your favorite ice cream. Alright, now we're going to make some candied bacon for our salad and our Brussels sprouts. Lay some thick cut bacon over a wire rack on a sheet pan, sprinkle generously with brown sugar, and we're going to put some fresh cracked black pepper over it. Bake for about 20 minutes or until golden brown. But be sure to reserve the bacon fat and brown sugar mixture that's collected in the bottom of the sheet pan. We're going to use it later. Now we're going to make a balsamic reduction for our salad. Add about 2 cups of balsamic vinegar to a saute pan. Turn to a medium-high heat and bring to a boil. We don't need to add any sugar or additives to it. All we want to do is reduce the moisture out. This is very easy, but you have to keep an eye on it so you don't burn it. You know the vinegar is reduced enough when you can scrape across it with a rubber spatula and it leaves a little bit of a trail. At this point, you can cool it down. It doesn't need to be cold, we just want it cooled off. Alright, so our steak has been resting for about an hour now. Now we want to pat it dry with a paper towel. Some moisture has come to the surface and we want to get rid of that. The more moisture on the surface, the harder it is to get a good sear. At this point, we can season our steak. You never want to pre-season a steak. You should only season a steak right before it's cooked. It's different if you're talking about a marinade, that's a completely different subject, but seasoning it, particularly with salt, brings moisture to the surface, and we want to avoid that so we get that good sear. So only season your steak with salt right before you cook it, and we're only putting salt on the steak. This is a big, beautiful steak, and we want to taste the steak. We're not going to put any crazy seasonings on it. We're not even going to put pepper on it. Pepper burns very easily, so we're going to wait till the end to put it on. So here I have a cast iron pan that's been heating up on a high flame for about 10 minutes. Because as soon as we put this 3-pound steak in there, it's going to bring the temperature down. So we want to get it as hot as we can in the beginning. And when you put your steak in the pan, if you don't immediately hear a loud sizzle and see smoke start coming up from the pan, then it probably wasn't hot enough. We want to create a beautiful crust on this steak. That's going to take a lot of heat. We're going to sear this steak for about 7 to 8 minutes on the first side, and do not turn the heat down. There's going to be a lot of smoke coming from the pan, but I promise the steak isn't burning. To get that beautiful crust, we want to leave the steak alone. So just let it sit there, and as the bone starts heating up, it can start dripping. So I just wrap it in foil to avoid making a mess. So after about 7 or 8 minutes, you should be ready to turn the steak. Slide the steak around the pan. If it moves freely and isn't stuck, then it's probably ready to be flipped. After we flip the steak, we're going to turn the heat down to a medium and let it cook for 2 to 3 more minutes. It's okay if you move it around on this side. After 2 to 3 minutes, we're going to add about 4 tablespoons of butter, a handful of fresh thyme, and a couple smashed garlic cloves. I would leave the peel on, it prevents it from burning. Now we're going to baste the steak. This does 2 things. 1, we're adding flavor to the steak by spooning this beautiful infused butter over the top. But 2, we're continuing to sear the top side of the steak with this hot butter. So as the bottom side is searing, we're continuing to caramelize the top side. As soon as you add the thyme and garlic to the pan, you just get this amazing aroma. It will caramelize relatively quickly with the hot butter in there. Just continue basting the steak for about 5 minutes. For a medium rare steak, which is what I'm going for here, you want an internal temperature of 135 degrees. But we don't want to cook it until it's 135 degrees. After we take it off the heat, it's going to continue cooking. There's a lot of residual heat built up in this steak from cooking in such a hot pan for so long, so it's going to carry over. So we're going to pull it at about 125 degrees internally. If you don't feel comfortable checking the doneness of your steak just by poking it, it's okay to use a probe thermometer. Just be sure to insert it at the thickest point somewhere near the bone, because that's going to take the longest to cook. Once we've reached our desired internal temperature of 125 degrees, we're going to put it on a wire rack to rest, and we're going to pour all that beautiful flavored butter over the top of it. Alright, now let's talk about Brussels sprouts. I think they get a bad rap. When cooked properly, they're delicious. I think the majority of people that say they don't like Brussels sprouts either had a bad childhood experience because somebody boiled the crap out of them and they were gross, or they likely haven't even tried them. I promise they're delicious, and here's an easy way to cook them. Cut off any big pieces of the stem. Other than that, there's really not a lot you need to do to them. Then we're going to slice them up about a 1/2 inch thick. Get a cast iron skillet on a medium heat. Add the bacon fat and brown sugar mixture we reserved earlier. Then we're going to add about a 1/2 cup of brown sugar. Mix that in, and we can add our Brussels sprouts. Season with salt and pepper and mix it up. Cook the Brussels sprouts for about 10 minutes. We want to get some good caramelization on them, but we don't want to overcook them. Once they look like this, we can deglaze the pan with a couple tablespoons of red wine vinegar and toss in half of our chopped up candied bacon. If you didn't like Brussels sprouts before, I promise you will now. Now to me, nothing screams steakhouse more than a wedge salad. And you can't have a wedge salad without blue cheese dressing. Start with a cup of mayonnaise, a cup of sour cream, and about a half a cup of buttermilk. Then add a splash of champagne vinegar, about a teaspoon of granulated onion, and some salt and pepper. Mix that up really well and then taste it for seasoning. Now we're going to add some blue cheese. I'm using Stilton here, but any creamy blue cheese will work fine. Rather than using iceberg, we're going to use this gem lettuce. You could also use hearts of romaine. Now to assemble the salad, I just drizzle over the blue cheese dressing, top with a candied bacon, cherry tomatoes, and sliced red onion, and then drizzle our balsamic reduction over the top. The combination of balsamic vinegar and blue cheese is phenomenal. Alright, to finish our steakhouse dinner, we need the perfect steakhouse sauce, and that's Bernaise. I know you're thinking to yourself, why do we need a sauce? This steak is going to be amazing on its own. We didn't put a lot of seasoning on it because we didn't want to cover up the flavor of the beef. Why would we put a sauce on top? The reason we're using a sauce, this one in particular, is it's super acidic. We need some acidity to cut through that richness and balance everything out. That's where Bernaise comes in. It can be a little tricky to make, but I'm going to show you the easy way. First, we need to dice up a shallot, chop up a few sprigs of tarragon, and throw them in a pan. Go ahead and throw the tarragon sprigs in there as well. We'll extract the flavor and take them out later. Then add 1 cup of red wine vinegar and 1 cup of champagne or white wine vinegar. And we're just going to put that on the stove and bring it to a boil and reduce it. We want to reduce all the liquid out. After 5 to 10 minutes, you can see how nearly all the liquid is gone. This is when we'll shut the heat off. The residual heat in the pan will help the rest of the moisture evaporate without us having to worry about burning it. Now we need to melt 1 stick of butter, which is 1/4 pound. We need to be really careful with the temperature of the butter when we use it because it will break the sauce. While our butter is heating up, get 2 egg yolks and our shallot reduction in a bowl. To that, we're going to add a splash of Worcestershire sauce, the juice of 1 lemon, and a good pinch of salt. Now we're going to put this over a small pot that has simmering water in it and continually whisk. We're trying to slowly temper the eggs the same way we did when we made the bread pudding, but instead we're doing it over a hot water bath rather than adding hot liquid to it. You could technically whisk in the hot butter the same way you did the cream mixture, but it's very likely that your sauce would break. Doing it this way ensures that your sauce will hold together and won't separate. Just keep whisking the eggs until they thicken. If the bowl starts getting too hot, or if you start to see steam seeping out of the sides of the pan, just take the bowl off, keep whisking, let it cool down just a little bit, and then put it back on. Once the eggs are thickened, they should look like this. Now we need to whisk in our butter. Roll up a kitchen towel and then form it into a circle and set your bowl into it. And that way it doesn't move when you try to whisk it. Very slowly whisk in your melted butter. The mixture will immediately get much thicker, but will begin to thin out as we add the rest of the butter. Once all your butter's in, taste it and adjust it for seasoning. It should be very, very acidic. You really want that bright acidity to cut through the richness of everything we're eating. You can make this a couple hours ahead of time if you want, so you're not trying to do too many things at once. Just keep it in a relatively warm place, but don't let it get hot. I set it on the counter next to my oven. If it gets too hot, it will break, and if it cools down too much, the butter will set. Now that our steak is rested, we can cut it. Run your knife along the bone to take it off, but I like to keep it as a presentation piece. Then slice the steak. Once it's cut, now is the time to season with flaky sea salt and fresh cracked black pepper. Now I'm sorry to all the vegetarians out there, but you can't compete with this. This is an amazing dinner, and even though it's a lot of work, it's much cheaper than going out to eat at a steakhouse. This steak alone at a prime steakhouse would cost $150 to $200. That doesn't include any sides, the salad, any of that. I made this entire spread for under $70, and if you invite some friends over, you're sure to impress them. Be sure to hit the subscribe button down below.